Kaiju movies have been a staple of both Japan and the US ever since Godzilla laid waste to Tokyo in 1954. But the 70 years since have been marked with many phases of massive popularity and almost total dormancy. By the year 2013, kaiju movies had been on the outs in big budget productions since Godzilla Final Wars brought the King of the Monsters to a close nearly a decade earlier. Their influence, however, had not been lost on the many creators brought up on giant monster battles, as well as the tokusatsu adventures of franchises like Ultraman, Super Sentai, and many more larger-than-life heroes and villains. Two of those creators were American screenwriter Travis Beacham, previously known for remaking Clash of the Titans and working on an unmade remake of The Black Hole, and Mexican filmmaker Guillermo del Toro, a writer-director with a love for monsters and gothic horror. Together, the two would create Pacific Rim for Legendary Pictures, a story of international cooperation in the face of annihilation, lived out through the childhood fantasy of giant robot and monster battles with a darker, scarier outlook. Now a dormant, possibly permanently dead franchise, the Pacific Rim series lived from 2013 through 2022, covering 2 films and a 2-season Netflix animated series. Starting before the birth of the Monsterverse and Godzilla's Reiwa era, but ending while both continue to succeed, the story of Pacific Rim is the story of a franchise with massive potential and the opportunity to give kaiju fans something they'd lacked for years. But it's also the story of that potential being squandered. So let's relive the battle between mankind and monsters, and see where this war to stop the apocalypse met its own end. The roots of Pacific Rim begin in 2006, with screenwriter Travis Beacham's script Killing on Carnival Row being taken on by director Guillermo del Toro. In what would not be the last time by far, del Toro's film never made it past its announcement, but this development did connect Beacham and del Toro. Shortly after, Beacham was living in Santa Monica, California, when he had a vision one night of a giant monster and a giant robot fighting in the Pacific Ocean just past the pier. They just sort of materialized out of the fog. These vast, godlike things, said Beacham. I didn't know that I had something that I really wanted to write until I realized these robots are driven by 2 pilots. And what happens when one of those people die? What happens to the leftovers? Then it became a story about loss, moving on after loss, and dealing with survivor's guilt. That makes the monsters scarier, because now you care about the people who are in these robots. This is essentially the key to all of Pacific Rim's aesthetics and its real reason for being. Not just a robot monster battle, but the darkness, a turbulent ocean, and a kaiju war fought in close proximity to human pilots are all what set the original film apart from most other tokusatsu movies, while its 2-pilot system would be the basis for the film's personal drama in our Jaeger pilots. Beacham's 25-page treatment for the film was purchased by Legendary Pictures in 2010, with del Toro soon signing on to produce and co-write the film, as he was busy preparing to shoot his adaptation of H.P. Lovecraft's At the Mountains of Madness. Now, we don't have time to get into all that, but if you're familiar with del Toro's extremely long history of unmade films, a subject that's just screaming for me to make a video about it if the man ever stopped creating canceled projects, you'll know that Mountains of Madness was canceled in 2011, when del Toro ultimately couldn't convince Universal Studios to approve his $150 million budget. So, with his massive passion project canceled, del Toro quickly signed on to direct Pac Rim, becoming co-writer with Beacham as the two built out the script over the following year, including getting an uncredited rewrite from novelist Neil Cross. Pacific Rim would ultimately premiere on July 12, 2013, with a budget of approximately $200 million. Still a massive budget for any film, but especially huge for a decade ago, and for a property with no pre-existing fanbase. Pacific Rim takes place in the near future, where an interdimensional breach at the bottom of the Pacific Ocean continuously unleashes massive alien monsters named Kaiju, which overwhelm coastal cities and threaten to destroy the world. In response, humanity builds gigantic robots called Jaggers, which are piloted by at least 2 people through a neural link that helps share the incredible load required to control these massive mecha. After detailing the outbreak of the kaiju, we cut to 2020, where brothers Raleigh and Yancey Beckett pilot Gypsy Danger, only for a new wave of dangerous kaiju to kill Yancey and wreck the robot.
Raleigh, listen to me!
Cut to 2025 and the Jaeger program is dying, as unending waves of kaiju threaten to overwhelm the last of humanity's defenders, bringing Raleigh out of hiding to team up with pilot in training Mako Mori and the remaining Jaggers against the most dangerous kaiju ever. There's a streak of international cooperation and deeper personal understanding that supplies the themes behind our multinational cast and the plot point that drifting only works by allowing yourself to be fully open to another and move past your own trauma. But I think that Pacific Rim's character arcs and drama are ultimately pretty weak. Apparently Del Toro cut a ton of scenes that would expand these aspects in order to remain focused on the action. That's okay because we're ultimately here to indulge in big budget kaiju mecha fights, and the film really operates on the rule of cool. Why do the pilots talk to each other out loud if they're psychically connected? Why does the world make robots instead of putting a bunch of cannons next to the breach? Why does Mako wait so long to deploy the giant sword instead of spamming it like Fox's wave dash attack? Because it's cool. Thankfully, Pacific Rim over-delivers on its fights and aesthetics, taking influence from decades of tokusatsu battles, and creating a high-quality CGI spectacle that feels like a kaiju fan's dream finally making it to the big screen, which it pretty much is, with Ramin Djawadi's score adding a heavy metal grandiosity to it all. The story is ultimately a mashup of kaiju films like Godzilla, especially with all of its creatures being amphibious like Goji, mecha anime like Patlabor. Beacham had actually not seen Evangelion at the time of writing the script, super robot anime like Tetsujin 28, which is much larger than life and features teams of robot piloting heroes banding together or even morphing into one, and real robot anime like Gundam, which tries to ground its mechanics and action in a more realistic application of physics. A lot of these specific influences find their roots in Del Toro's exposure to anime and manga while growing up in Mexico. And the international crossover of influences and cultures is also evident in the multicultural cast of Pacific Rim, as every nation that lines the Pacific Ocean joins the fight against the kaiju. Or did before most got their shit rocked at some point in the past. That blend of Latino audiences loving Japanese stories is actually not surprising at all to me, because that was me too. I, a multiracial Latino, along with basically every other Latino kid in my middle school, was obsessed with Dragon Ball Z. It's hard to explain, but the ways in which these anime are empowering speaks to Latino culture. Pacific Rim's kaiju, while drawing inspiration from decades of Japanese design for not just their species name, but also how they act and feel, don't draw any direct homages to previous monsters. In fact, I had previously said that Knifehead was a clear homage to Giron from the Gamera series, but designer Wayne Barlow had never heard of Giron before making his original design. Instead, the kaiju of Pacific Rim are a blend between animal and weapon, drawing from real-life creatures like gorillas, goblinfish, eels, and lobsters, while their escalating capabilities reveal that every monster is by design, hinting at their true nature. Weapons built by the other-dimensional alien precursors to overwhelm and wipe out humanity to prepare the Earth for colonization. My favorites are Leatherback, essentially an electric gorilla, and Otachi, a Swiss army knife of an eel. It helps that they get the most screen time as the FTR of kaiju, tag-teaming our Jaggers in the film's incredible extended Hong Kong fight. Slatter is also really cool, as the Category 5 big boss, but doesn't get as much screen time. The Jaggers are an evocative blend of sci-fi tech that is far removed from reality, and heavy tank weaponry that gives a sense of practicality to how these creations move and attack. Given that the majority of the film takes place after a decade of war, the remaining Jaggers represent different generations, with the Russian Cherno Alpha being an early nuclear reactor with massive fists, the Australian Striker Eureka and the Chinese Crimson Typhoon being state-of-the-art sleek fighters, and the American Gypsy Danger being a sort of mid-century Art Deco design that blends the Chrysler Building with John Wayne. This is, of course, our star Jaeger, and beats everybody's butt. USA, USA, USA. The creatures and mechas you see on screen are the product of Pac Rim's large group of concept designers making hundreds of models and drawings, and slowly winnowing them down to final approved designs, with a weekly American Idol-like voting competition. All of these massive fighters are shot by the incredible cinematographer Guillermo Navarro with Industrial Light and Magic, to create an overwhelming sense of weight and scale. Kaiju and Jaggers crash through waves and crush buildings with heavy steps and punches, and every fighter swings and moves with its massive weight dragging through the air. Creating that scale and heaviness was always a challenge for suitmation teams in classic tokusatsu, relying on a blend of miniatures, forced perspective, and great actors to make it work. Obviously, CGI gives creators a lot more control over what they're bringing to life, but it also allows films to stop following any of the laws of physics. The heaviness and destruction created in Pacific Rim immediately sets it apart from most previous giant robot and monster movies, as well as how often these creatures are shot from a human perspective to emphasize their terror and awe. More than a decade later, it's a little less unique, as plenty of films have learned from its example, but it's still really freaking cool. Almost all of Pac Rim's fights happen in hard weather, at night, in a storm, at sea, even underwater, and it's a really smart decision. These settings not only help to add a sense of gravitas and terror, they create enough blurring and obscuring to cover up any CGI shortcomings. It's the same technique used by Steven Spielberg and Dean Cundey in Jurassic Park. There's a reason why the T-Rex still looks amazing. The team knew their exact limitations and shot with those in mind. Jurassic Park still looks incredible 30 years later, and I think Pacific Rim will too. When you are a kid and you watch a kaiju movie, there is a guiltless glee in the fact that monsters are destroying a city, said Del Toro. There is no consequence. It has no relationship to the real world. There is never going to be a kaiju copycat attack because a kaiju saw a movie in a mall and he decided to destroy the mall. There is a glee to Gamera totaling a whole city block accidentally because he tripped. And one of the things I did is immediately vacate the cities. It's just material destruction in a fun way that is a staple in kaiju movies. It's not related to the real world. You need a little bit of innocence to allow that to happen. What's funny to me is that Del Toro gives us a much more intimate focus on our human pilots, who feel every hit, blow, and torn limb from the robot. So every death feels much more shocking. It's absolutely brutal in its action. Del Toro doesn't shy away from showcasing just how mercilessly his Jaeger pilots are killed in combat, drowning, crushing, and blowing up the supporting cast that, while looking cool, ultimately add up to being little more than red shirts in the larger scope of the story. It's just that given how they're introduced in the story, you don't expect them to be so easily torn to pieces by the monsters. Of course, this makes every battle much more intense and memorable, but I also think it places this film in a very strange target audience. Too intense for kids who could easily watch a Showa Gojira movie, too silly for adults that want a more mature film for their tastes. Generally speaking, Pacific Rim is fun action first, plot and character second. So while I think its ideas of global cooperation and understanding are nice, it's mostly a seasoning on top of the tokusatsu dish, instead of a real reason for being. We're always pushing toward the next fight, and that kinda makes everything in between feel a little slow. Really, my favorite non-combat aspects are everything with Charlie Day's Newt, Bern Gorman's Herman, and Ron Perlman's Hannibal Chow. Of course, Perlman is a Del Toro mainstay, but these characters and their side plot of squishy kaiju experiments in labs filled with practical effects feel the most in line with Del Toro's warm and cozy gothic horror aesthetic. And, not to be overly critical, but Charlie Hunnam as Raleigh Beckett is a weak lead. Raleigh just isn't very interesting as generic good guy number one, and Hunnam is really hampered by putting on an American accent.
To fight monsters, we created monsters of our own.
When acting next to Rinku Kikuchi's haunted Mako Mori and Idris Elba's charismatic Stacker Pentecost, maybe the greatest name I've ever heard, he feels very bland. It ultimately makes Raleigh more of a plot mechanic to get us to the next fight instead of someone to invest in. The appeal of Pacific Rim's modern kaiju action would lead to a $411 million box office, the majority of the take being international, and China actually being the biggest country for the film, landing the movie at the 16th highest grossing of the year. Maybe not exactly what Legendary was aiming for when Iron Man 3 made over $1 billion that same year, but still strong enough to warrant a sequel. Like any modern franchise featuring a massive new world and the hopes of becoming a long-running series, Pacific Rim launched with several stories outside of the big screen, including the comic book Tales from Year Zero, a novelization of the movie, remember when every blockbuster had one of these? And several minor video games. With the breach closed and our heroes victorious, Pacific Rim gives us a happy ending without even any real hint of future stories. Of course, Del Toro had ideas in place for more kaiju battles, stating, "We have plans that are pretty bold and pretty crazy. We would not be repeating anything from the first one. We would go to completely fresh territory." Unfortunately, he would never get to bring them to the big screen.
Everything you got?
Released on March 23, 2018, Pacific Rim Uprising is the bright, shiny, kid-friendly new model of Pac Rim. And even if you didn't know that Del Toro had left the project, the entire film so obviously screams of Legendary demanding that the original vision have all the style and darkness sanded off for an easy-to-market new entry guaranteed to make so much more money. It didn't, and the result is something very bland and forgettable. Why? Well, most of the original creative team isn't involved. In the 5 years between films, Del Toro crafted a sequel script with Zach Penn and intended to begin filming in November 2015. But delays by distributor Universal and the purchase of Legendary Pictures by Chinese Wanda Group caused major behind-the-scenes changes, including moving production to China, which interfered with Del Toro's plans for Shape of Water. By 2016, Del Toro had left the project beyond a producer role, with Stephen S. DeKnight now directing and the script written across multiple drafts by John Spates, Derek Connolly, Stephen S. DeKnight, Emily Carmichael, Kira Snyder, and T.S. Nolan. Pacific Rim Uprising takes place 10 years after the first, with the world continuing to rebuild after the breach was closed. Our star this time is Jake Pentecost, played by John Boyega, previously heretofore unmentioned son of Stacker Pentecost, who is happily living as a black market thief until he's pulled back into the Pan-Pacific Defense Corps. Jake then works to train a new generation of Jaeger pilots until a squad of kaiju brain-controlled Jagger drones opens a new breach, restarting the Precursor's plan to wipe humanity from the Earth. As for why we suddenly have the character of Jake, well, it's because Uprising was written with the intention of having Hunnam's Raleigh return as the lead. But when Hunnam couldn't return due to scheduling conflicts, the writers created Jake, essentially keeping everything the same around him. Where is Raleigh? Well, the script originally revealed that he got cancer from his trip to the Aniverse and died. But DeKnight chose to cut this from the final film, which I think was for the best. And Mako? Well, Kikuchi returns with her character now in a director position, but is soon killed off in a very anticlimactic helicopter crash. This is what we call pulling an Alien 3, and it never works out well. There are several other changes here that reflect the 10-year time jump. As opposed to the state of the original, where kaijus were unending and Jaegers were being shut down, kaijus are now nowhere to be found, and Jaegers are plentiful as global police. Most of the trainees are teenagers, with Kaylee Spaney's Amara are scrappy young survivalists now in training, and the Jaegers themselves are very sleek and fast, with the new Gypsy Avenger turning the lead mech into something that's more like a samurai than a gunslinger. There's nothing necessarily wrong with these new Jaeger designs, but they highlight a massive issue with the sequel. Its embrace of light, colorful adventure that becomes very forgettable in both design and story. You remember that sense of scale, hard weather, tank-like mechs, disturbing monsters, and brutal deaths? Well, let's throw that all out here. In fact, let's do the opposite. Most of Uprising's fights take place during the day, which immediately makes this look worse. Its heroes and villains spring through the air with little collateral damage, and most of our pilots come out unscathed, even when their Jaegers explode into a million pieces. Its teen team, bright color scheme, exaggerated action, Scott Eastwood, and much lower stakes remind me of Power Rangers or Michael Bay's Transformers. That's not a knock on those franchises. Plenty of Power Rangers is fun, and I have a soft spot for Bayformers. I think Dark of the Moon kinda honks, but it means that Uprising removes all of Pacific Rim's unique aesthetic and storytelling identity in favor of being more mainstream accessible. It also ends with Jake and crew swearing to this time bring the fight to the Precursors, after defeating the scheme of a now mind-controlled Newt.
They won't need to worry about coming for us, because we're gonna come for them.
This is the exact same ending from Independence Day Resurgence from 2 years prior, and just like that movie, the story didn't continue. It's very clear that Uprising was made in a way to seed a larger franchise, with a slightly smaller budget of $176 million and that brighter, friendlier tone we've been talking about. Well, so much for that, because Uprising would only make $290 million worldwide, a steep decline from Del Toro's original. See, sequels are supposed to make more money than the first, or at least around the same, to make the case for studios to continue investing. And when that didn't happen, just as Legendary's Monsterverse was taking off and making more money than either of these movies, Pacific Rim went dormant, aside from one last entry.
I advise immediate retreat.
Wrong advice. Together. We keep going!
Pacific Rim: The Black lasted 2 seasons, beginning March 4th, 2021 on Netflix, totaling 14 episodes, developed and co-written by Greg Johnson and Craig Kyle, with Johnson known for his work on X-Men Evolution and Kyle having worked on a lot of direct-to-video Marvel animated movies. And while The Black is planted within the larger Pacific Rim universe, it tells a very contained story that requires very little pre-existing knowledge, and ultimately impacts very little outside of its story. The series was originally announced as Pacific Rim: Steel Warriors by Del Toro to pave the way for characters in his sequel, but when Del Toro left, the project massively changed. Instead, The Black is set in Australia, where kaiju have essentially overrun the entire continent, cutting it off from the rest of the world when every remaining human evacuates. Every human except for teenage brother and sister Taylor and Haley Travis, who are left behind by their Jaeger pilot parents in an effort to protect them. The siblings then find the abandoned Jaeger Atlas destroyer and work with its artificial intelligence, Loa, to survive the outback. The Black is at first very vague about its place within the franchise timeline, but eventually we learn that the story is post-Uprising, making it the furthest into the future the series has gone. However, placing it in an abandoned Australia removed from anything else in the world gives the creative team the chance to sort of do whatever they want in their story without worrying about canon. There's also a few new expansions of franchise lore, most important being a young boy who is actually a kaiju in disguise, able to shift from young kid to massive monster in a moment, and having no allegiance to the precursors. That makes The Black a little frustrating to any fan of the franchise. Yes, we get more Pac Rim, and The Black has some fun action and a good-looking cel-shaded 3D animation style. But making a story where kaiju are still on the loose but no real information about the state of the world is available makes the Netflix show a somewhat frustrating entry. Whatever you may feel about The Black, and I think it's fine, not allowing the show to really advance the world or give solid answers to Uprising's incomplete sequel bait is even more annoying knowing that this is basically the end of Pacific Rim. The Black reaches a definitive conclusion, but the world of Pacific Rim never did. So, years after Uprising shifted the path of the franchise, the question is, what was Del Toro's original plan for Pacific Rim 2? In 2021, far enough past Uprising for everyone involved to be confident that nothing Pacific Rim was ever going to reach the screen again, Del Toro revealed the villain was this tech guy that had invented basically sort of the Internet 2.0, and then they realized that all his patents came to him one morning. And so, little by little, they started putting together this, and they said, oh, he got them from the precursors, the guys that control the kaiju. And then we found out that the precursors are us, thousands of years in the future. They're trying to terraform, trying to re-harvest the Earth to survive, and that we were in exobiosuits that looked alien, but they were not. We were inside. And it was a really interesting paradox. So you can see some of the ideas that Del Toro had in mind that were being turned into a script with Zach Penn when he left the project. Uprising would feature a human whose brain is influenced by the precursors in the form of Newt, and a kaiju Jaeger hybrid, which Del Toro had been hyping up ever since the first movie, which came to life in the kaiju-controlled drones. Sort of an inverse of his idea. But essentially everything around these elements was changed. Most of all is that Del Toro would have never killed off Mako. To me, the hero was Mako Mori, said Del Toro. I wanted her not only to live, I wanted her to be one of the main characters in the second movie. Would a Del Toro-led Pac Rim sequel have been more of a success than what was ultimately made? It's impossible to say. Del Toro's movies have never been box office juggernauts. In fact, Pacific Rim is his biggest hit ever. And personally, I have been somewhat lukewarm on most of his work after Hellboy 2, which is one of the best comic book movies ever made. But I'm always excited by the incredible imagination and aesthetics he brings to every film. At the time of this video's release, it's now been 2 years since the end of Pacific Rim: The Black, and 6 years since Uprising. In the time since the battle between kaiju and Jaggers was last in theaters, the landscape of big blockbuster franchises has changed considerably. But most importantly, kaiju have totally resurged, with Godzilla coming back in force in both America with the Monsterverse and Japan with Shin Gojira and -1. While King Kong has been given more of a spotlight than he has in generations. And while Pacific Rim was able to build its own original world that felt unique, at least for one film, it's a world built off influences, giving audiences the big-budget modern tokusatsu action that had really been missing for years. Pacific Rim, as its own brand of kaiju film, never got the chance to really grow and define itself. especially as Legendary Pictures fully embraced the MonsterVerse as their successful kaiju franchise. So where does that leave Pacific Rim? Well, the last we heard, Denied had said he had ideas of a third film, as well as the desire to cross the series over with the MonsterVerse. I guess that since we're dealing with dimensional portals, that could happen. But where would that even fit with the MonsterVerse story? It's an idea that smacks of the desperate need to latch onto something successful to stay alive. And obviously, none of those plans have come to pass, rendering Pacific Rim, like the apocalypse, cancelled. Given that there are only 2 films in the Pacific Rim franchise, and the original being so obviously better than the sequel, there's no need to do a ranking as I do in every retrospective. So instead, let's rank every Jaeger and Kaiju in the franchise, or at least the live-action ones with any real screen time. Honorable mention goes to Trespasser, Mutivore, Karloff, Crabcakes, and Insurrector, who are only briefly on screen during Pacific Rim and Pac Rim Uprising. They look cool, but they don't get time to shine. At 18, the team of Hakuja, Shrikethorn, Raijin, and the Rippers, who are the kaiju that make it through Uprising's man-made breach. And while they look decent, they suffer from the film's poor presentation of its creatures, without any given a real chance to make an impression. These ultimately only serve the purpose of making the film's climactic mega kaiju. At 17, the Jagger Drones. The idea of kaiju Jaeger hybrids is really cool in theory, and is enough to sell me on the idea of a sequel to break new ground, but the drones are ultimately just a plot device. At 16, Oni Baba, the only kaiju to appear in both movies, once in flashback, once in simulation. Oni Baba is a giant crab that wreaks mass destruction by its mere presence. Its significance in Mako's past gives it some emotional heft. At 15, the Jaeger team of Bracer Phoenix, Guardian Bravo, Titan Redeemer, November Ajax, and Saber Athena. I'll be damned if I could tell you which is which off the top of my head. And it doesn't help that some of their abilities are shared across multiple Jaegers, while they all sorta move and act the same. I can't really rank these separately. At 14, Scrapper. The most Bayformers Jaeger ever is a tiny little guy driven by a tiny little girl. While I think the design in the Samus Aran mode is fun, it's definitely indicative of the family-friendly angle they went for in the sequel. At 13, the baby kaiju. Otachi's bastard offspring. Does a pregnant kaiju really make sense if they're all bioengineered by the precursors? No, but it was definitely wish fulfillment for Del Toro, and makes for an equally gross and scary scene before it's strangled by its own umbilical cord like baby Vin Diesel in the Chronicles of Riddick. At 12, Gypsy Avenger. The Apple update of the Star Jaeger lacks the real personality of Danger, but I like how it's essentially a samurai rebuild that keeps the proportions while adding new features like the gravity whip. At 11, the Mega Kaiju. The Precursor's big secret weapon is built out of the earlier mentioned team to make something real huge, and despite being in broad daylight, Denied and company give it some mystery and gravitas, although it essentially functions the same role as Devastator in Revenge of the Fallen, with less scrote. At 10, Crimson Typhoon. All sizzle, no steak. China's triple-piloted Jaeger might be the biggest jobber in mecha history, but it looks awesome while getting wrecked. The 3 arms and hypermobile body is like a superposable action figure. You can move it around a lot, but it's way too easy for your little brother to break. At 9, the tag team of Raiju and Scunner. An aquatic duo, Raiju and Scunner are like a crocodile and a bison, with the precursors making them the strongest underwater to protect the breach. They don't show up for long, and are probably the hardest to fully make out in the dark water, but they're terrifying. At 8, Obsidian Fury. Pac Rim's first evil Jaeger has a kaiju brain, while its twin plasma chainsaws make for some pretty awesome Jaeger duels. Its design is, again, kinda anonymous, because every Jaeger in the sequel has almost the exact same silhouette, but it feels more dangerous than any kaiju in this movie. At 7, Striker Eureka. Diminished a little for me because it seems like every Uprising Jaeger is trying to look like Striker. I think its position as both high-tech and super skilled in the original makes it somewhat of an unfairly overlooked Jaeger. Love the chest-mounted rockets that act like the trump card of any battle. At 6, Cherno Alpha. To me, Cherno represents what's so exciting about the mech designs in Pac Rim. This Russian bruiser is a clunky nuclear reactor who ultimately pounds every enemy to death. Its analog nature is a standout, alongside the horrifying drowning death of its husband and wife team. At 5, Slatter. the big bad of the original pack Rim, Slatter is a whirlwind of tentacles and is really scary, especially when it's so mobile underwater versus the very limited Jaggers. There's something unknowable about this beast, acting as the ultimate kaiju guardian that is tough enough to withstand a point-blank nuke. At 4, Knifehead, a goblin fish with, what else, a knife on its head. This Giron-adjacent killer looks even cooler in the midst of a raging storm, and the deadly attack it unleashes on Gypsy Danger sets a precedent of fear for the rest of the movie to come. At 3, Leatherback. An electric gorilla has, technically, already been done by Toho's take on King Kong, but this deadly homage to it still feels totally unique. It's almost a boxer with its club-like fists, while its EMP throws a massive wrench in our hero's plans. Its sea-to-land fight with Gypsy Danger is my favorite part of the entire franchise, because it's brutal and so satisfying. At 2, Gypsy Danger, the greatest of the Jaggers. Not just because it has some badass hero moments, like emptying the clip into Leatherback, but because its design is overflowing with personality and style. An all-American, almost big guy and rusty creation that screams hero and something unforgettable even after decades of mech stories. And at number 1, Otachi. Swimming, crawling, flying, crushing, and spitting acid, Otachi is fantastic because it's so unpredictable, acting like a Swiss Army knife that seems to roll with every punch and come back with an even deadlier attack. Otachi is easily one of the best kaiju I've ever seen, and that's not just because of what it can do or how it looks, but how Del Toro and company frame and present it as a terrifying threat to even the most battle-hardened Jaeger pilots. Despite being a franchise that never reached its full potential in a really small amount of time, I think there's a lot of Pacific Rim that is stuck in the minds of kaiju fans, thanks to the brilliant minds of Guillermo del Toro and the many creative people that brought it to life. And while kaiju movies have moved on in both bigger and more personal films in the years since, Pacific Rim will always have a special place for fans, as a moment where anything seemed possible. Thanks for watching today's video, and of course you already know by now that kaiju films have a huge presence on this channel, but maybe you weren't expecting me to zag into Pacific Rim just yet. Pacific Rim is one of those franchises that I've gained a little bit more appreciation for over the years, as I've continued to dive deeper and deeper into kaiju and tokusatsu films, although I'll always see it as a flawed franchise that never fully reached its potential, even in the first film, which I think is really fun and delivers some of the best kaiju and mechs ever. To me, it's just a movie that has too many flaws with its characters and story dynamics to really feel fully satisfying as an experience. And of course, Pacific Rim Uprising truly killed this series. And that's something that I wouldn't fully blame on any one person, but I would put the blame more on circumstances and the studio as a whole pushing this franchise into something that just didn't work. As I mentioned in the video, the fights, aesthetics, and designs of the original Pacific Rim are some of the best kaiju stuff ever made. And in particular, I think that Otachi, Leatherback, and Gypsy Danger are just some of the best things ever. So really, I could rewatch that Hong Kong fight all the time. And within the larger context of the Monsterverse and the Reiwa era of Gojira moving forward, you can really see some of the strands of DNA from Pacific Rim start to intertwine with them, giving those creators more context for how to shoot their monster fights in a more realistic, highly dramatic manner. So overall, I really do think the Pacific Rim has benefited kaiju films as a whole, even if it had to die in order for that to happen. Obviously, there are many more kaiju series retrospectives to come this year, and while I won't give anything away yet, expect a return to Godzilla sometime this year, and a frequently requested monster series retrospective that will be tying into a big blockbuster movie that's coming very soon. You can probably guess what I'm talking about. But until those videos come out, I'd love to hear your thoughts on Pacific Rim, your favorite aspects of the series, and where you would have liked to have seen it gone. As always, a huge thank you to my patrons for their continued support. And if you'd like to be a patron, it's only $1 a month for early access to every video and exclusive access to Patreon-only audio reviews. By the time this video goes up, I will have started my next Patreon-only review series, which I'm titling Miyazaki Madness, which includes me talking about every film by the great Hayao Miyazaki. And that's going to be a multi-part, multi-month retrospective, only on Patreon because Studio Ghibli loves to copyright everything. So until next time, I hope that you're taking care of yourselves and enjoying a great kaiju movie.